The newsroom was abuzz with anticipation. The stage was set for what was supposed to be a routine press conference, but anyone who had followed Karoline Leavitt's career knew that routine was rarely the right word to describe her interactions with the media. She was sharp, articulate, and unafraid to call out hypocrisy when she saw it. As she stepped up to the podium, the reporters in the room adjusted their microphones, readying themselves for what they assumed would be another round of the usual political back and forth. What they didn't realize was that today, Karoline had come prepared to turn the tables on them in a way that would leave them scrambling for words. A journalist from one of the major liberal networks was the first to fire off a question. His tone was smug, his words carefully chosen to push a narrative that he and his colleagues had been building for months. Ms. Leavitt, given your party's constant criticism of so-called media bias, do you believe your stance is actually harmful to democracy? After all, a free press is a cornerstone of our nation, yet you consistently attack journalists simply for doing their jobs. Karoline took a breath, letting the weight of his words settle in the room before responding. A free press is indeed a cornerstone of democracy, she said, her voice calm yet firm. But let's be honest here. What we have today is not a free press. We have an activist press. We have journalists who selectively report stories to fit their ideological biases. The same people who claim to champion truth conveniently ignore facts that don't align with their narrative. So tell me, does democracy suffer when I hold the press accountable for its hypocrisy, or does it suffer when the press manipulates the truth to serve a political agenda? The reporter opened his mouth as if to respond, but Karoline wasn't done. She turned her gaze to another journalist, this one from a well-known newspaper that had spent years attacking conservative figures while conveniently overlooking scandals within its preferred party. For instance, she continued, your publication ran over a dozen articles pushing false stories about Russian collusion. Yet when those claims were debunked, there was no retraction, no apology, just silence. But when a single unverified allegation is made against a conservative, it becomes front-page news for weeks. Is that doing your job as a journalist, or is that pushing an agenda? The room grew tense. A few reporters exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. Another journalist, eager to shift the topic, interjected, but Karoline, isn't it hypocritical for you to criticize the media while benefiting from coverage? Yourself? Karoline smiled. I'd love to answer that, but first let's talk about real hypocrisy. Your network spent weeks blasting conservative politicians for attending events during COVID, yet when Democratic leaders broke their own lockdown rules, dining maskless, partying while telling Americans to stay home, your network barely covered it. So tell me, where's the consistency? Silence. She continued. And let's not forget how certain outlets went after conservative parents for voicing concerns at school board meetings, labeling them as domestic threats. Meanwhile, violent protests that fit your political narrative were described as mostly peaceful. Do you see the problem yet? The tension in the room was palpable. The journalists, so used to controlling the narrative, found themselves on the defensive. One finally muttered, "We report the facts." Karoline raised an eyebrow. Facts, or selectively chosen facts that fit a political agenda? Because if you reported all the facts, you'd be covering corruption, hypocrisy, and failures on both sides. But that's not what happens, is it? Murmur spread across the room. Some journalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others hastily scribbled notes, perhaps trying to salvage something from the wreckage of their once confident questioning. Karoline leaned in slightly, her voice unwavering. The American people aren't stupid. They see what's happening, and they're tired of it. With that, she stepped back from the podium. The press conference was over, but the message had been delivered, loud and clear. The room was frozen in place as Karoline Leavitt stepped back from the podium. For a moment, it seemed as if no one knew what to do. The usual script, where reporters framed the narrative and politicians fumbled to defend themselves, had been torn to shreds. A few journalists shuffled their papers, whispering among themselves, trying to regain some control. One of the more seasoned correspondents, a woman known for her aggressive questioning of conservatives, cleared her throat and leaned forward. "Ms. Leavitt," she began, attempting to compose herself. "If you're so concerned about media bias, why do you and your party constantly attack journalists instead of working with them?" Karoline turned to her, a knowing look in her eyes. "Work with them? That would require them to actually report fairly. Let's be real. When was the last time your network ran a positive story about a conservative who wasn't forced into the coverage by overwhelming public support? When was the last time you gave airtime to a conservative voice without twisting their words?" The reporter opened her mouth but hesitated. Karoline pressed on. "And let's not pretend this is a one-sided issue. Remember how your network fawned over politicians who encouraged protests that turned into riots? Yet when parents protested at school board meetings, they were painted as dangerous extremists. Can you explain the difference? Or is it only acceptable when it fits your preferred political agenda?" The reporter's lips tightened. "That's an oversimplification." Karoline let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, is it? Because when your network ran stories about conservatives questioning election integrity, they were labeled as threats to democracy. But when Democratic politicians did the exact same thing in 2016 and 2000, it was framed as protecting democracy. Funny how that works." Another reporter, desperate to change the subject, cut in. "Karoline, don't you think this kind of rhetoric is dangerous? By attacking the media, aren't you encouraging distrust in journalism?" Karoline turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You're asking if I'm responsible for the public losing trust in the media? No, you are. Your industry is. The American people don't trust you because you've given them no reason to. They see the double standards, the selective outrage, the hit pieces disguised as journalism, and instead of taking responsibility, you blame the people calling it out." The journalist shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Karoline continued, her voice growing more intense. "Let's take another example. Your network repeatedly ran with stories claiming certain political protests were insurrections. But when violent activists stormed government buildings for causes you support, you called them activists fighting for justice. The hypocrisy is glaring." The tension in the room was suffocating. Some reporters scribbled furiously, others avoided eye contact, knowing they had no real rebuttal. One of them, clearly frustrated, scoffed. "So what? You're saying conservatives are the real victims here?" Karoline shook her head. "I'm saying the American people are the victims. The people who just want honest reporting, not narratives disguised as news. People who want their concerns taken seriously instead of being mocked by late-night talk shows and opinion hosts masquerading as journalists." She leaned in, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "The days of the media controlling the narrative without pushback are over. People are waking up, and no amount of spin will change that." A deep silence settled over the room. The reporters, so used to shaping the story, suddenly found themselves part of one they couldn't control. Karoline glanced around, as if daring anyone else to challenge her. No one spoke. She smiled. "I think we're done here." With that, she turned and walked off the stage, leaving the room in stunned silence. The press conference was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. As Karoline walked off the stage, the stunned silence of the press corps lingered for a few more moments before the room burst into hushed, frantic discussions. Some reporters immediately turned to their cameras, scrambling to spin the narrative before it got away from them. Others simply sat there, still processing what had just happened. Backstage, Karoline was met by her team, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and amusement. One of her aides, a young man who had been with her for years, shook his head with a grin. "That was brutal," he muttered. "They didn't know what hit them." Karoline smirked. "They never do." Outside the press room, the internet was already ablaze. Clips of the press conference were spreading like wildfire, with some conservative outlets hailing it as a masterclass in exposing media hypocrisy. On the other side, Liberal commentators were scrambling to downplay the damage, labeling Karoline's statements as dangerous rhetoric and an attack on the free press. But it wasn't just conservative voices reacting. Ordinary Americans, people who had long grown tired of the double standards, were flooding social media, sharing their own stories of media bias, of how they had lost trust in mainstream news outlets. The hashtag Bars Media Hypocrisy Exposed began trending within an hour. Meanwhile, inside one of the major liberal news networks, a group of executives gathered in a conference room, watching the fallout in real time. The mood was tense. "She made us look like fools," one of them grumbled. "We need to hit back." "How?" another asked, rubbing his temples. "If we go after her now, we'll just prove her point." The room fell silent. They knew Karoline had backed them into a corner. Any attempt to smear her would only add fuel to the fire. But ignoring the moment wasn't an option either. One of their top anchors leaned forward, his face grim. "We find something, a misstep, a past statement, anything. She embarrassed us today, but we control the long game." Back at Karoline's office, she sat at her desk, scrolling through the reactions. She wasn't naive. She knew the media machine wouldn't take this lying down. They would dig, they would distort, they would find ways to twist her words. Her chief strategist walked in. "They'll come after you harder now," he warned. "They can't afford to let you win this one." Karoline leaned back, crossing her arms. "Let them try." Her phone buzzed. It was a message from a prominent conservative figure. "That was legendary. You just changed the game." She smiled. The battle wasn't over, but today at least, the hours following the press conference were chaotic. News networks were in full damage control mode, desperately trying to reframe what had just happened. Some anchors dismissed Karoline's words as right-wing conspiracy theories. Others claimed she was attacking the integrity of journalism. A few, however, seemed visibly shaken, as if they knew deep down that she had exposed something they couldn't easily deny. As Karoline scrolled through the news coverage, she saw the usual tactics being deployed. Clips of her speech were carefully edited to make her seem aggressive, commentators used loaded language to portray her as dangerous, and social media fact-checkers were already working overtime to discredit her points. None of it surprised her. But what did surprise her was the overwhelming response from everyday Americans. The flood of support was unlike anything she had seen before. People were sharing their own experiences, how they had been lied to, how they had lost trust in the media, how they finally felt like someone was standing up to the deception. Her phone rang. It was one of her closest political allies, an experienced strategist who had seen his fair share of media battles. "You've got them rattled," he said without preamble. "I've never seen them scramble like this before." Karoline chuckled. "They're not used to being called out on their own turf." "No, they're not," he agreed. "But listen, this isn't over. They're already planning a hit piece. I'm hearing whispers about them digging into your past, trying to find something, anything to use against you." Karoline wasn't surprised. "Of course they are. You need to be ready. They'll distort, twist, and outright fabricate if they have to." She exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "Let them dig. They won't find anything." "That won't stop them from making something up," he warned. Karoline knew he was right. The media had done it before, twisting words, taking things out of context, painting a false picture. But she wasn't afraid. If anything, she was more motivated than ever. "Then we keep pushing," she said firmly. "They can try to silence me, but the truth is already out, and the people are listening." Meanwhile, in a high-rise newsroom, a group of producers and senior editors were strategizing their next move. "She hit us harder than we expected," one of them admitted. "She embarrassed us," another corrected. "And if we don't hit back, she'll do it again." One of the lead reporters tapped his pen against the desk. "We need to paint her as extreme, dangerous, a threat to democracy." "But how?" a younger journalist asked. "Everything." she said was factually backed up. The room fell silent. Finally, one of the top executives spoke. "It doesn't matter. Perception is reality. We create the narrative, and we make sure it sticks." And just like that, the media machine went to work. The next morning, the headlines were ready. Every major liberal outlet ran some variation of the same story: Karoline Leavitt's dangerous war on journalism. Opinion writers churned out hit pieces, accusing her of inciting distrust and undermining democracy. Talk show hosts mocked her, twisting her words into something they weren't. Social media platforms mysteriously began suppressing posts that supported her. It was a coordinated attack. But Karoline expected nothing less. She watched as the media storm unfolded, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet determination, she picked up her phone and sent out a single tweet. "They're proving my point in real time." The response was immediate. The American people saw what was happening, and they weren't buying the spin. The media had played their hand, but Karoline had already won the trust of the people. And that was something no headline could undo. The moment Karoline's tweet went live, it sent shockwaves through social media. Within minutes, thousands of people had liked, shared, and commented, fueling an online movement that even the mainstream media couldn't ignore. The public wasn't falling for the spin. If anything, the media's coordinated attack only reinforced everything she had exposed. On cable news, panels of pundits scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Some doubled down, calling her reckless and irresponsible. Others tried a new approach, painting her as an attention seeker who was desperate for relevance. But their efforts were falling flat. On alternative media platforms, independent journalists and commentators were tearing apart the media's hypocrisy in real time, replaying clips from the press conference and juxtaposing them against the blatant contradictions in the headlines. Some commentators even brought up past instances where journalists had openly admitted to biased reporting but had faced no consequences. One particular video went viral, a side-by-side comparison showing how the same reporters who had dismissed violent left-wing riots as passionate protests were now calling Karoline's words a threat to democracy. The contrast was undeniable. Meanwhile, inside the headquarters of a major liberal news network, tensions were rising. The executives had expected pushback, but not like this. Their usual tactics weren't working. Instead of turning the public against Karoline, their smear campaign had only fueled more discussion about media bias. "We need a new angle," one producer muttered, scrolling through Twitter in frustration. The lead anchor leaned forward. "What if we shift the focus, make it about her? Dangerous rhetoric leading to real-world consequences. We can tie it to online extremism, maybe even connect it to misinformation." A younger journalist hesitated. "But there's no evidence of that." The anchor scoffed. "There. Doesn't need to be. We just need to ask the question, could Karoline Leavitt's rhetoric lead to real-world harm? And that's enough to plant the idea." And just like that, the media's next attack was set in motion. The following morning, the headlines shifted. Experts warn Karoline Leavitt's rhetoric could stoke extremism. Political scientists concerned over Leavitt's anti-media tirade. Social media analyzes dangerous trends following Leavitt's statements. It was a textbook tactic. When direct smears didn't work, they moved to fear-mongering. Instead of attacking her outright, they framed her words as potentially harmful, allowing them to push the narrative without needing evidence. Karoline saw it all unfolding in real time, but instead of backing down, she decided to escalate. That evening, she went live on her own platform, directly addressing the media's latest spin. They want you to believe that holding them accountable is dangerous, that demanding the truth is somehow a threat to democracy. But ask yourself, who's really the threat? The people exposing the lies or the ones trying to silence them? She then displayed a montage of past media deceptions, false stories, blatant contradictions, double standards. They don't fear misinformation. They fear losing control of the narrative. The response was explosive. Millions tuned in. And by the next morning, her video had more engagement than the top 3 liberal news networks combined. The establishment media had overplayed their hand, and Karoline Leavitt